Can you hear this now? Can you hear this in the back? Hello back there. Hello, hello. Okay, turn out the lights in the back, please. We're ready to start. So you can start the timer, Lauren. Al Bielek is with us this morning, and he is one of the few survivors from the Philadelphia experiment. If you don't know what the Philadelphia experiment is, he'll tell you, but a lot of you are familiar with it. Al was born on the name of Edward Cameron, and the Navy chose, I'm briefing, he'll fill you in on this, after the Philadelphia experiment, somewhere along the line, to change his name and wipe out his records with them, and successfully, for many, many years, erase his memory of the occasions that took place. I don't want to tell anymore. Well, he did. He attended Princeton and Harvard and graduated with a PhD in physics there at Harvard, enlisted in the Navy in 1939, and became involved with Dr. von Neumann and Nikola Tesla at Princeton, New Jersey, on what was called Project Rainbow. This was mentioned in your program, but we didn't mention the word Philadelphia experiment in the program, but Project Rainbow was. And after the project failed, he was removed from the Navy and given a complete brainwashing and a new identity. You now have the new identity coming forward. Welcome this morning, Al Bielek from Phoenix, Arizona.
Yes, this is working good. I'm going to get wired up here with all kinds of microphones. Well, now that we've gotten everybody up, we'll try to keep you awake. How many of you here know really what the Philadelphia experiment was all about, or have some approximate idea? Well, it's just getting better by the audiences in the last year. The first audience in Phoenix, Arizona, in last September. Very few people knew anything about it. Seems to be getting better as I go. Perhaps the word is getting around finally. How many approximately when the project started? I will give you a bracket. Do you think it was in the war years, like 1941, 42? I don't see any hands up. That's interesting. One. How many of you think it was earlier than the war years, or it's at its inception? Now, again, the word's beginning to get around. I kind of give you, in this 1 hour, the whole story, the balance of it. I will give you in the workshop Monday, including some slides. But now I'll give you an introduction on this. How many of you have seen the videotape, The Philadelphia Experiment? Not too many. I'm going to do a brief introduction by way of the lecture by showing you what EMI Thorne did in the way of a movie back in 1984. It was released in August of '84 and had a very interesting history. They were interfered with by the US government. It was done by an English crew, EMI Thorne. And 3 days before the video was to be released, they got a letter from the United States government saying, we do not want this film shown in the United States. Initially, it was not as a video, it was as a movie to be circulated and shown simultaneously in various cities of the US. They didn't know what to do. They already had release dates posted. So they ignored the letter and went ahead and showed the movie. It showed for a week in Sedona, Arizona. I was there at that time, but I didn't see it. A week later or so, they got another letter from the US government. We don't want this shown in the US, so EMI Thorne could not ignore the second letter and says, well, if you want it stopped, you'll have to get a court order. And the US government said, we will, and they did. Banned it for 2 years. EMI Thorne got a relief from that earlier injunction in '86, and it's been available ever since. Sounds like the volume is off somewheres. Is that better? It's still not too good. They turned me down. I was a little louder earlier, but we have a feedback problem. Okay. If the video projector is ready, I'll have to move back a little bit. We're going to show the opening of the film up to a certain point because it's a very good introduction as to what happened. Is there?
Did you see the ship, the town? Yeah, it was spinning around. Was cool.
Okay. What was portrayed in that movie is quite accurate up to that point, other than the date. The ship did disappear, and the personnel, can you hear me all right? The ship did disappear. The personnel, the two who jumped overboard, was my brother and myself. The rest of the story is rather long, but we'll try to fill you in. Let's go back a little bit in history in terms of the experiment as it started. Basically, it began in 1931 with a feasibility study program engaged in by Nikola Tesla, Dr. John Hutchinson, then Dean of the University of Chicago, and a third party who was a physicist at the university, Dr. Kurtenauer. Their object was to study the possibilities of making an object invisible. They were not very successful at that point, but of course paper studies usually take quite a while. The Navy was interested from the beginning. They did do some funding. $10,000 or $20,000 in those days was a lot of money. In 1934, the project was moved to the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. In 1930, actually, the university had set up, and actually quite independent of the university was the Institute. It was founded in 1930, and they started to staff up in 1933 on the Princeton property, but with a totally separate facility. Among the first people who joined in the Institute and were invited to join and staff it up was a certain gentleman who's fairly well known, Albert Einstein. Einstein, by the way, I won't go into the history of Dr. Einstein, but he came to the United States in 1930. Unlike some of the biographies, he spent 3 years at Caltech in the University of California, in California at Pasadena. And he was teaching there for 3 years. He was invited to join the Institute, which he did in 1933. He remained there until his death in 1955. Dr. John von Neumann, who had left Germany in 1930, was also teaching, however, at the graduate school at Princeton until 1933. He was invited to join, which he did in 1933 at a salary of $10,000 per year, which was a great deal of money in those days. He remained at the Institute for many years and became part of the project at a later date. Other people who became part of the project in terms of their expertise and the mathematical background was Dr. Hilbert of Germany. He was born about 1867, if I remember correctly, or 1872. Born in Germany, lived in Germany, took his education there, taught in the German school system, first at Königsberg, then at one of the other universities until 1930, whereupon he retired. Dr. David Hilbert is most noted for the fact that he developed a very important system of mathematics called Hilbert space. Hilbert space is very important in terms of the fact that he laid out mathematically the groundwork for multiple universes and multiple realities, and expressed perhaps for the first time how you can do it, at least in mathematical terms on paper. Another man who is in the background here but did not actually have any part in the experiment was a well-known mathematician, a Russian, P.D. Ouspensky, who in his book Tertium Organum, translated meaning a new model of the universe, in 1931 described our system, which we recognize, that is our physical reality, as a 5-dimensional structure. We're all familiar with 3 dimensions, the 3 that we touch and see. Einstein, of course, described the 4th dimension, time, which I'm sure many people, or most people, have heard about. Ouspensky referred to a 5th dimension. He was rather vague about it, but nevertheless, he was correct. Hilbert went into the mathematical theory, and it's also rather important that in 1927, von Neumann met Hilbert in Germany, did a paper in Germany on some of Hilbert's work, and then went on and did much research on his own and developed entire new systems of mathematics, among which became the most principal one, perhaps the new algebra, as it's sometimes called, the von Neumann's works. And he developed much of the background work which led to the Philadelphia experiment. Another man, of course, figures in the background because of his electronic contributions with T. Townsend Brown. He has a very strange history. He was born in the United States in 1922, attended several universities, eventually acquired a degree, had a great deal of difficulty during the Depression years. In 1938, he'd already been in the Naval Reserve. The Navy tapped him on the shoulder and says, "You're in the Navy now. We have a project for you. We're setting up a new department. We want you to take care of the mine problem for minesweepers, mines, and particularly the German magnetic mines." It is important because T. Townsend Brown did parallel work and eventually became part of the project. He was particularly noted for his expertise, of course, in electrostatics. He is well known for his attempts to generate flying saucers, but this has nothing to do with this particular project. In the work which he did there, he developed magnetic pulsing techniques for destroying the German magnetic mines at a safe distance from the hull of a ship. The idea was if you generated a huge magnetic field, the mine in its sensing apparatus would see a ship close by, and they were calculated so that literally the hull of the ship had to be essentially over the mine before it would explode. But if you had a large field, the mine detector system was foiled. It would blow up at a safe distance. The parallel technology actually took place a year or two before the Philadelphia experiment. It was actually an adjunct to it, all done at the Institute, all under Albert Einstein's purview, if you will. Einstein, by the way, was a consultant to all projects at the Institute. He was called at sometimes the general. If you had a problem, you went to see the general. So he was a consultant that took care of all of the little problems that developed in all of the projects. Now, in 1933, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was re-elected President of the United States. He had already known Tesla. He had met Tesla in 1917 when he was Under Secretary of the Navy, and asked Tesla if he would like to do some work for the government to aid the war effort in 1917. Tesla said certainly yes. He became acquainted with Roosevelt. He developed a number of things. One of them is quite well known today. It was the Rogers antenna system, a communication system and antennas which used a technology then unknown for communication by voice to Europe, static-free, in 1917. The entire system and the patents were classified. They surfaced in 1923 in one of Hugo Gernsback's publications, and then they seemed to get buried again. But nevertheless, it did come to public view, and the work which was done then is more or less known today, though not well known. In 1933, Tesla was again invited to Washington to see Mr. Roosevelt, now President Roosevelt. Asked again if he would like to do some work for the government. He said, yes, I would. That is how Tesla became director, the first director of the project, which was then called Project Invincibility. It was not classified at that point. It was not a government project per se at that point. It was a private study being done at the Institute of Advanced Study, funded, however, by the Navy as well as by the Institute. 1936 comes around, and after a lot of work and building some experimental hardware, they had their first test. The test was partially successful. They did achieve some degree of invisibility of an object. They put it out in a shed. I have slides of all of that, which I will show Monday. And they isolated from the main lab because they frankly weren't sure what would happen. But the test did show some results and that they were on the right track. So work progressed, and they were funded with more money, and more personnel were added. In 1940, they were ready for their first full-blown test, which was conducted at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. They used a small ship, a tender. They had the tender with cables feeding the equipment which was on board, with two ships adjacent, starboard and port. And on these cables, they fed all the power and signals to the equipment on the tender that was necessary to make the circuits work and the equipment function. Came the time of the test. There was no one on board the tender. They deliberately made certain there was no one on board. The test was fully successful. So at that point, everybody, including President Roosevelt, was elated. The project was immediately classified, as is typical, Project Rainbow. The war was not yet on. This happened in earlier 1940. And, of course, the war for the U.S. didn't occur until a year later. The project was classified. The Navy gave it unlimited funding. Roosevelt had full faith in his old friend Tesla. And he says, well, we'll give you a real ship to work with this time. So he gives him a battleship, which was tied up at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. And testing proceeded, and the equipment was designed and built for that. Very briefly, without going into the details, the system entailed, both for Tesla and for von Neumann's system later, the use of very high-powered magnetic fields, as well as RF equipment. The original setups involving the magnetic mine degaussing system involved cables wrapped around the hull of a ship. Tesla refined it and built 4 coils mounted on the deck of the ship, which were conical, typical of Tesla's designs. And they were driven by 2 huge generators. Where they put them on the battleship, I don't recall. I know where they were in the Eldridge. As well as some RF equipment involving 4 RF transmitters and special antenna systems. The interaction between the RF fields of the 4 transmitters, which were controlled by a master pulse generator and other equipment designed by Tesla, was to produce a rotating time field. Now, to go in a little further into the theory, time is a dual element. We have the 3 dimensions, if you want to look at it vectorially, we have the 3 dimensions, length, width, and height, which are 3 dimensions at right angles to each other. According to Einstein and others, time flows as an essentially linear function at right angles to those 3. In our minds, we cannot really depict how you could have another vector at right angles to the 3 we know. It's not in the grasp of our minds, but it's true in the sense that those 3 dimensions flow in time, therefore it is a 4th vector. Now that vector depicts a linear flow of time. It also has a vector rotating around it, which is called a spinner. And is that 5th item, the spinner, which is the 5th dimension. That is the one that is worked on and was worked on by the equipment to produce the invisibility field. The object was to produce a field of invisibility for the ship. And I might point out in 1940, there were very poor radar systems. The technology also began about 1931 for radar. But we didn't have anything like a really sophisticated radar system in 1940, so they were concerned about ship invisibility. By 1943, that had changed drastically. We had very good radar, as did the Germans. Now, where did I fit in this? That's perhaps your next question. I was born in 1916, August 4th. Edward A. Cameron, son of Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr. My brother, Alexander Duncan Cameron Jr., was born in May of 1917. We were born into a family that had considerable money, not what you would call truly wealthy, but they were well off. Our father was a very strange character. He himself was also in the Navy during World War I. There are pictures in the family album showing him in his sailor suit. No records to show when he joined or when he left. All we can do is piece together some of the missing pieces, and it indicates that he stayed the full 20 years, retired in the early 30s, probably with his standard retirement, because he never worked again a day in his life. He became a hobbyist, built sailboats, not little toys, but full-size ones, which he raced in the regattas in Long Island. Took some trophies, which are still in the family collection. He got tired of a boat, he'd sell it and build another. He also traveled to Europe. And we don't know how he established his connections, but he had connections with the Navy and obviously with intelligence. Came the early 30s, of course, we finished on almost schooling. There was a depression on, so Duncan and I decided to go to school. There was no problem with money in the family. He wound up going to the University of Edinburgh in Edinburgh, Scotland, took his PhD in physics in July of '39. I started out at Princeton. It was at that time, in fact, that I met Van Neumann, and he suggested that I go to Harvard for my PhD rather than Princeton, so I did, and I took a PhD in August of '39. And as was arranged by our father, we were given commissions in the Navy when we joined in September of 1939. Spent some 90 days, you know, the 90-day wonder school. You probably have heard some of the stories if you were around during World War II. At Providence, Rhode Island, and then we were assigned to the Institute. We became part of the project. It was a twofold task we had. One was to report to the Navy the progress of the project. Since we had the expertise to do so, we were chosen for this because we had the educational background, and we learned what we needed to know additionally about electronics. And we had, you might say, a sort of an office at the Institute, and we had a main office at the Philadelphia Navy Yard on the top floor of a very special classified building. Things went on, and of course, the Navy decides usually we want their people to go to sea. So in 1941, we were tapped on the shoulder, you're going to do some sea duty. So January '41, we went to sea on the USS Pennsylvania, BB-38, if I remember the right number correctly. And we're all over the Pacific. And strangely, having checked out the history of the Pennsylvania, that ship apparently spent more time in dry dock than any other ship in the Navy's history. It actually dated back to World War I. It was built in the early days of World War I, so it was quite an old wagon. But it also was one of Roosevelt's favorites, so they kept it up to date. Well, it came time for dry dock again in October of 1941, and it went into Pearl Harbor. We went on leave, went to San Francisco. On the 5th of December, we were scheduled to return to Pearl Harbor. We were about to get on board the plane. We were stopped by a Navy captain, took us aside, said, "Your orders are canceled." We went upstairs in one of the buildings and were confronted by the director of the Office of Naval Engineering, as it was then called. It became the Office of Naval Research in 1946, Hal Bowen Sr., then Rear Admiral. And he says, "Gentlemen, your orders are canceled. We know that the Japanese are going to attack within 48 to 72 hours, and we have reason to believe it will be Pearl Harbor. You're much too valuable for us to send you back there. Your orders are canceled. You will stay in San Francisco and do some paperwork, because that's the home office or the home base for the Pennsylvania. In January, we'll be returned to the Institute." It says, "Make the most of the time while you can, gentlemen, and enjoy it, because you will have no time for anything but hard work after you're back to the Institute." So we did. We enjoyed our leave in San Francisco. We had a ball. What sailors don't, particularly in San Francisco. January '41, we returned. January '42, we returned to the Institute, and of course the work was well underway for the test of Tesla. The background of Tesla perhaps should be expanded a bit. In 1917, he was working as an engineer with American Marconi Corporation. During the war years, that company was seized as a possible hotbed of foreign saboteurs, foreign entanglements, and so forth, seized by the U.S. government. And in 1919, a new corporation was formed, RCA, Radio Corporation of America. It was incorporated, I believe it was August in 1919, and in December it went into operation. Virtually all of the personnel from American Marconi, including Tesla, were transferred to RCA. And Tesla became an engineer with RCA at that point. He then became director of engineering at a later date. In 1935, he became vice president and director of all engineering and research worldwide for RCA Global Communications, which post he held until he retired in 1939, and that is not public record, but it is if you know where to look. And they had a retirement party for him at Cherry Hill, New Jersey, which was rather convenient, of course, to the Institute. He became very involved, of course, in communications. He designed some very special receivers for RCA. A friend of mine, Preston Nichols, has a set of those now operational in his lab in Long Island. I don't have the pictures of them, but they are very interesting in their design. They're extremely sensitive and very stable. Though built in 1931 and having been in storage for perhaps 15 or 20 years, they still functioned when they were turned on. And they're still working. He also became involved due to his work at Colorado Springs in 1899, 1900, and another aspect which was not appreciated at that time. In fact, his scientific colleagues took a very dim view of it, his communication with ETs. He made public announcements of this in 1900 and again in 1923. And in 1931, 32, when he was allegedly becoming a recluse, he was more active perhaps than any other time of his life. He had two laboratories in New York. He had his residence, if you will, at the New Yorker, and a laboratory there, basically his receiver setup, and both twin towers and the top floor of the Waldorf Astoria, in which he had another lab and all of his transmitting facilities. He also, of course, had a lab at Princeton. From those facilities in New York, he carried on with communications with outside of planet Earth, to whom nobody seemed to know, but two people have attested to me directly who saw that equipment and knew Tesla in the latter days of his life that he was communicating with somebody off planet, ETs in plain language, extraterrestrials. And it was probably due to that he was told or required the information which said he would have a very serious personnel problem with the equipment he was building. He would probably wind up with a number of dead bodies on his hand. He did not want to take the responsibility for this. He went to the Navy, asked for additional time to design some equipment, a system to counteract what he knew would be a very serious personnel problem. Well, of course, after the attack in December 41, there was a war on, and literally the Navy told him there's a war on. You have a deadline for your test. It's March 42 is correct, and get with it. So Tesla had two choices. Go ahead with the test, risk what might happen to the personnel, or sabotage the test. And he chose the latter. He was certain there would be a problem. And he refused to accept responsibility for what would happen to the personnel when he knew there was a way to correct it and was not given the opportunity to make the equipment to correct the problem. So came the test date in March 42. He sabotaged it, detuned the equipment, made sure it wouldn't work when everything was turned on, so nothing happened. So he said at that point, gentlemen, the test is a failure. I am bowing out. I have other things to do. You have a very good gentleman here who will take over and be your new director, Dr. John Van Neumann. So Van Neumann became the director. So what's Van Neumann do? He goes to the Navy and says, well, gentlemen, I have to study the problem and see what's wrong. Quite logical. And of course, the Navy had to go along with it. They had no choice. So he studied the problem, realized quickly that there was possibly a serious problem, but he did redesign the equipment to a pulse mode of operation. And to compress the story, a special crew was chosen. The Eldridge was taken off the drawing board, and the equipment was designed to fit into it with the two main generators in the forward hold, number 2 gun turret. And as you saw there, the tests, 2 of them were conducted. The first one, both tests with an experimental crew, specially chosen. First one was 22 July 1943, in which they achieved in radar as well as optical invisibility. Was very successful in terms of the hardware. But they had a problem with personnel being disoriented, nauseous, totally mentally destabilized, if you will. So when the ship was returned to dockside after an approximate 20-minute test at 1000 hours in the morning, a new crew was assigned. Van Neumann knew he had a very serious problem. He had listened to us eventually that there was a problem, and he knew it then. Went to the Navy for an extension on time. The Navy said, no way, there's a war on. Do what you have to do to make it work, but you have a deadline, drop dead date, 12 August 1943. If you can't make that date, forget it. We were all working furiously around the clock. Came the date. Everything was ready, we thought, and we went out in the harbor. Actually, my brother and I were very apprehensive. So we were given the radio command, as per the movie, turn the equipment on for about 70 seconds. To the outside observers, everything appeared to be functioning correctly. Radar invisibility was achieved. There was no true optical invisibility, though there was a great haze of fog, greenish in color. And then after about 70 seconds, the ship disappeared completely. As the movie indicated, on board, there was a great deal of problems. We realized from the outset that something was wrong, seriously wrong. And when everything started to nearly explode around us, we tried to shut the equipment off, found the handles frozen. We could not shut it off. We got zapped. We decided the only way out was outside. And we both simultaneously got the idea, let's jump overboard and jump in the bay and swim ashore. We jumped overboard all right. We did not wind up in the bay. We wound up on shore at Montauk, Long Island, inside the perimeter of a military base at Montauk, which was then known as Fort Hero and was the other terminal of this experiment known as the Phoenix Project. At approximately 2 a.m. in the morning, and a very bright light was shining down on us. We felt this fence in back of us. We didn't know where we were or what had happened. A very, very bright spotlight and this noisy thing overhead, a helicopter. What did we know about helicopters? Sikorsky was still working on them in '43. MPs grabbed us, took us down below into one of the labs, and we were confronted by Dr. Van Neumann, an old man. He says, I am Dr. Van Neumann. We've been expecting you. And he says, you're who? He says, you're a doc. We have been expecting you. I am Dr. Van Neumann. He eventually convinced us of the fact, and of course, looking around there, seeing video displays, terminals, equipment like we had never seen, we knew something was wrong. He told us briefly, we know what has happened. The 2 experiments have locked up. We've created a huge hole in hyperspace. The Eldridge is in it. You have to go back and smash the equipment and return that ship to its normal place. I said, we can do this here. The Phoenix Project did achieve total control of time and space, and I emphasized time because they achieved that proverbial Sagan wormhole in space theory. They had it in fact. They could ship anyone or anything anywheres in space or time, and they shipped us back to the Eldridge, whereupon we took axes and smashed the equipment. The ship's fields slowly collapsed, the generators wound down, and we went out on deck, and we looked around us, and as the haze cleared, we saw people lying all over. But before it cleared completely and all of the fields collapsed, my brother, for some reason, I do not know to this day, chose to jump overboard and return to 1983. I remained with the ship in '43. We relocated in the same point of time and space, that is, minus about 3 or 4 hours. Radio commands could not be followed. Everybody was in a complete turmoil, and most of the people were in worse than a turmoil. We found 4 people buried in the steel, 2 in the decks, 2 in the bulkheads, a 5th man with a hand buried in a steel wall. And total pandemonium. They sent a crew out with a launch to see what had happened, put the crew on board, reported by radio that things were in great difficulty, sent another crew to getting the ship back to dockside. It was visible that damage had been done to the superstructure of the ship, and one of the special antenna masts built by T. Townsend Brown was broken and partially missing. And of course, we had left the control room a shambles. 4 days of meeting resulted. We were in, the personnel who survived were in quarantine. Some went to Bethesda. A number went straight to the funny farms and stayed there the rest of their lives. Others were floating around. Some got their feet back on ground, some never did. And 4 days of meetings, they didn't know what to do. They finally decided, we'll run one more test. In October 43, they had a lot of spare equipment because they expected the test to be successful. And that was done in October 43, unmanned in the lower harbor. And the ship disappeared for 20 minutes, came back minus a lot of its equipment and smoldering ruin in the control room. At that point, the Navy decided to wash their hands of everything and sent the ship out to sea with a normal crew in a normal manner, which the Eldridge had sea duty, was retired in 46, was given to the Greeks in 1951. I remained with the Navy, was assigned to other projects. In 1947, after the gross and fundamental changes in our military establishment, it was decided that I knew too much. I was given a total brainwashing treatment. I won't go into the details now. Given a new personality, a new family name of Al Bielek, knew nothing whatever of all of this, and went back again through school and became an electronic engineer for 30 years as a consultant, retired in '88. Now, how did I come to remember all of this? In '85, I was exposed to the area where the Phoenix Project took place at Montauk, Long Island. Preston Nichols invited me out after one USPA meeting in Toledo, Ohio in '85 to his lab. He took us out there, myself and my brother Duncan, who is a little younger than you would expect because he was reborn in another body, which is a long story. And we sensed the enormously gross fields of Phoenix Project, still there after the equipment, what was left of it was still there. The base was open to become a park for the state of New York. It started to trigger memories. First at the Phoenix Project, then in '88, when I, for the first time, saw the movie, it hit me like a bomb, and I started to remember the Philadelphia experiment. I've had verification from other people since who remembered me and the part of this project. And there have been a series of books written. I'll go very briefly into this because I'm almost out of time. The first one that was written was Thin Air, entitled that name. It was a fictional book, 1978. Authors Simpson and Berger. It gave a fictionalized account of the experiment. The most famous was the Philadelphia experiment, done by Berlitz and Moore in 1979. They found part of the story. They could never get the whole story, and a lot of their information was hazy. There is a new book coming out, mine. You want to get this on camera? Which is not mine solely. It is done with Brad Steiger as well as myself, entitled The Philadelphia Experiment and Other UFO Conspiracies. It was a conspiracy, but to develop the background to show how it would take about 2 hours, which I can do in the workshop. And it was absolutely essential for the two experiments at 12 August 1943 and 12 August 83 to lock up through hyperspace. Otherwise, what happened would never have happened, and the aftermath and the consequences would never have occurred. Dr. Van Neumann is still alive today. Official records say that he died December or sometime in '57 of cancer. They gave him a new identity, but he remained on the project, and he was a director of the Phoenix Project until '77, whereupon he became a consultant because he developed a split personality. Today he is the split personality, if you will, Howard E. Decker, and generally remembers nothing of that past. When I visited him last November in his farm in upstate New York, he remembered nothing of the experiment. He told stories for hours about his exploits as an electronic surplus dealer. We finally asked him, "Don't you remember me?" He says, "Yes, I do remember you from somewheres, but I don't know where." It was very sad. Most of the other personnel are now gone. There are a few survivors. Alan Batchelor, who is one of them, is still alive. Carlos Miguel Allende passed through Long Island last November. He was looking for me, but I was unavailable. I was on a shopping tour with my brother. And strange things like this have continued to happen. I do not have absolute proof yet, but I will one day. Insofar as proving Van Neumann lived through this and did exist past 1957, I have a hard copy here of his books, taken off a computer run, some 15 of them, and he wrote books up through the '70s. And this is off a standard computer run from any major library. He also was an engineer and developed the Z100 computer, the personal computer for Zenith Electronics, later sold as a kit by Heathkit. Z100 and Z100A, he was there until 1980, as verified by the company personnel who knew him. I'm probably out of time, so I think at this point I will close and I will invite you to the workshop where I'll give you the rest of the story and a slideshow and attempt to explain all of this as to how it really happened and how our government has really total control of time. Thank you.